This is True News, the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help us God. I'm Rick Wiles. Last week, we told you about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy's odd comment that his country would become Big Israel. We continued researching the topic and found a lot of fascinating information to share with you about a movement to declare Kiev the new Jerusalem. Now, if the main proponent of the scheme was not a billionaire, we would not pay much attention to it. The deeper we dug, the more we found. Doc Burkhart is back and ready to jump into this fascinating topic. Doc, good to have you back.
Good to be back, and I just want to say thank you to all the messages from viewers and listeners that offered their condolences, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yes,
so
yeah.
It meant a lot to me.
Absolutely, Doc. We're glad to have you back.
Good to be back.
Okay, so where we left off last week, it was
we
one of
just
these.
touched on it too.
It was just an odd story, and President Zelenskyy said Ukraine would become Big Israel.
Right.
All right. And so we scratched the surface, took a look at it, said, okay, this is odd. Okay, so there it is. Jewish telegraphic agency, Zelenskyy, Ukraine will become more like Big Israel than Europe in the wake of Russia's war. Now, this is the president of Ukraine. He's Jewish.
Right.
And he's being hailed as a hero. They're trying to make him look like Churchill or some great statesman, despite his pornographic, obscene videos online, which have been scrubbed.
Right.
All right. They don't want anybody to see the real Zelenskyy. But the fact that he said post-war Ukraine will look like Big Israel.
And then no less than the Jewish telegraphic agency putting this article out about it. So,
And then he told us why it would be Big Israel.
So,
there was one quote in that story that said a lot.
So Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Ukraine's Jewish president, said his country would look more like Israel, a democracy on constant military alert, than like their more relaxed European neighbors, given the prospect of long-term tensions with Russia. We will become a big Israel with its own face, Zelenskyy said Tuesday at a briefing for Ukrainian media, Haaretz reported. We will not be surprised if we have representatives of the armed forces or National Guard in cinemas, supermarkets, and people with weapons. I am confident that the question of security will be issue number one for the next 10 years. I'm sure of it.
Okay, so what he said was, if you want to look like Israel, you'll have to be a police state.
Basically, yes. And that's the first, when you first look at the article and first look at the quote, that's the first impression that you get. But he did use that word, Big Israel. And of course, that got us digging into some stories from the past and some interesting articles that we came up with. Right. One, the Times of Israel. All right. So this was originally published back in 2014. And it talks about the, Israel acknowledges Jews, in fact, Khazar's secret plan for reverse migration to Ukraine. Now, if you go to that website, even today, it has this warning label on it. This blog post is a work of satire. We talked about this last week, but that warning label was only placed on this website February 28th of this year. So for 8 years, this article existed as general information on the Times of Israel website and until February 28th of this year, when Russia made its advance into Ukraine, suddenly this became a work of satire overnight. And so they go out of the way to say it was published in 2014 on the eve of Purim, a Jewish holiday that is celebrated with wild merrymaking and raucous comedy with a particular emphasis of poking fun at anti-Semitism and ignorance. So basically this is all a big joke, right?
Okay, but the fact is Ukraine, present-day Ukraine, does exist inside the borders of ancient Khazaria.
Right. And the article here actually goes through that and lays out that information. And so for 8 years, that was reliable, quotable, referenceable information, but until February 28th of this year, it became satire.
That's right. And so why is Khazaria important? Because I think it was it the 8th century?
Yes.
Around the 8th century, the king of Khazaria converted to Judaism.
Right.
And basically issued a decree and told everybody in Khazaria, we're all Jews now.
Right.
And so it became a Jewish nation. A lot of people think that the Ashkenazim in Europe, the Jewish people of Europe, are descendants of the Khazaria Empire. Now, if that is true, then that makes this story even more interesting because that would mean that they're not Semitic.
Right.
The true Semitic people are Palestinians, anybody in the Middle East that speaks a Semitic language. Semitic is not a race,
right.
It's a language.
Language group, yeah.
Something like 300 Semitic languages. So the Ashkenazim didn't speak a Semitic language. What they speak now is a reconstructed Hebrew. Hebrew had been lost. The present day Hebrew language is made up. They had no idea how Hebrew was spoken.
And
so it was
most
reconstructed.
European Jews spoke Yiddish anyway.
Yes, that's right.
Or a mixture, primarily German. German influences there, but most of them spoke Yiddish and everything.
Okay, so what we have here, Doc, is if Khazaria was an ancient nation that voluntarily converted to Judaism in the 8th century, it is now basically modern-day Ukraine.
Right.
The people who went to Palestine in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and then eventually overthrew the Arabs in Palestine, they were not Middle Eastern Jews who had lived in Palestine all their lives and their families could trace their history back centuries.
Right.
They were Europeans.
Right. And neither were they Sephardic Jews either. Sephardic Jews are a branch of Judaism that exists primarily in Spain and Portugal, but they can trace their lineage back to the Middle East. They were transplanted from there, but they did not participate in the recolonization. They have no desire for it. And
so most likely they're authentic Jews.
Right. So, but they don't desire to return to Palestine. That's what's unique about them. Now, there are Sephardic Jews in Israel, but primarily they don't seek that out. And so
you have European Ashkenazim people claiming to be Jews, but most likely they are descendants of Khazaria. They migrated to Palestine, overthrew the Arabs, overthrew the Arab Christians, the Arab Muslims, and the Jews who were living in Palestine. This is 1948. They used blood and fighting and warfare to establish this modern Zionist state, and the Middle East has never been calm since.
Right.
And a lot of Jewish people are now starting to think they made a big mistake. That it was a mistake to go into Palestine with weapons and use warfare, revolution, to overthrow the Arab population and establish a Zionist state. They're really starting to doubt the whole narrative of the Zionist movement.
Because right now, as it stands, Israel's what's called Israel there is a nation or a state, I got to watch my nomenclature here, of 10 million people, surrounded by 150 million Arabs.
Yes.
Okay, so the odds are against them there. Now, that Times of Israel article I quoted to you a little while ago from 2014, as I said, was updated as satire on February 28th of this year.
Days after the war started.
Right. So basically it said all this information in this article is made up. Okay. However, another publication in Israel, Haaretz, published an article when Ukraine was
the next day,
yes,
in 2014.
Very next day. And it doesn't say anything about satire in it at all to this day. You can go to this site today, and it doesn't say it's satire. And it basically has the same information in this article as was on the Times of Israel article. Mm-hmm. The same history, the same information. In fact, it references other publications have recently talked about the Ukrainian connection with Judaism. And so it goes through and basically lays out the entire Khazarian history, as Rick mentioned earlier. So basically, which one is satire, Rick? The Times of Israel article or the Haaretz article? Or are they both true?
They're both true.
Up until February 28th of this year, they were all referenceable articles that you could quote.
There's no debate. Honestly, this is not a conspiracy theory that Ukraine, it wasn't called Ukraine at the time, it was Khazaria. There's no debate that Khazaria was run by Jews.
Right.
But they were not ethnic Jews, they were Europeans who converted to Judaism.
Right.
Okay, now this is where this gets really, folks, is going to start getting strange, okay? And I'll just tell you right now, this is one of those shows and one of those topics I'm going to give you advance heads up notice. Doc and I are thinking this through as we do this program. This is so fresh to us that what we say today, we may have a different perspective by next week on this. I'm just telling you, because you're watching us unveil this in real time. Okay, so we're learning with you on this. So be patient. I may change my opinion on this a month from now. We may get more information.
Well,
so,
if we go back to that number
right.
3 still,
Right.
Rick, there was something else in that caught our attention and got us talking about it.
Right.
So it's the second part of that headline, of the satirical article that was fact for 8 years. Secret plan for reverse migration to Ukraine. So that is what caught our attention.
and that's what the Times of Israel in February of this year implied. That's satire.
Right.
Don't take this article seriously. There is no secret plan for reverse migration to Ukraine. Okay, this is where it's going to start getting weird. So last week, Doc, while you were back in Missouri, I received an email from a dear supporter of True News in Sweden, Rudy. Thank you, Rudy, for that email, because your email just caused me to go down a rabbit hole I had never considered before. But Rudy said, Rick, I remember an article from 2012 involving Henry Kissinger. So I searched for the article and I found it. 2012, 10 years ago, page 6, this is New York Post, page 6, New York Post. Look at the headline, No More Israel.
Right.
From September 2012, Henry Kissinger says in 10 years, when would that be? 2022.
Right.
There would be no more Israel.
So the actual quote from that article on page 6 in the Times said this: Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, current savant of the state of the world. Do not argue with Mr. Kissinger's know-how. He already knows how. Middle East horror. Democratic Party dissing Jerusalem. D.C.'s anti-Israel mentality. Obama busy raising re-election funds, no time for beleaguered Netanyahu. The Oval Office attitude versus the red line. Iran's oath to destroy our only friend in that part of the world. Reported to me, Henry Kissinger has stated, and I quote the statement word for word, in 10 years, there will be no more Israel. I repeat, in 10 years, there will be no more Israel. And we actually have a screen capture of that actual article. This is Cindy Adams' column in the Times. This is back
New York
Post, September 18th, 2012. And you can actually see right there, that very first paragraph there, talking about what Mr. Kissinger said on that particular day. So,
and right there, it's kind of a gossip column under there. She's talking about Harvey Weinstein
yes,
and stuff.
I saw that. So,
but this is what she wrote for the New York Post, September 2012. She's saying, I was told by a reliable source that Henry Kissinger said, and I quote, in 10 years, there will be no more Israel. I repeat, in 10 years, there will be no more Israel. Would not Henry Kissinger know if that is satire or real? So, 10 years from 2012 is 2022. here we are. And we have Mr. Zelenskyy saying Ukraine will become big Israel.
That's right.
Okay, we're going to take it a little bit deeper. We're going to show you more facts, evidence that there is some type of plan being considered. I'm not saying that this is going to happen. What we're showing you here today is that there are some very important people and very wealthy people who are openly talking about relocating the Zionist state from Palestine to Ukraine. That's what we're going to show you here today.
And they've been talking about it for a while.
Yes.
So going back in time once again, so a lot of things were going on. In 2012. So this is Foreign Policy Journal. Okay, U.S. preparing for a post-Israel Middle East. That's the question that's asked there.
Foreign policy. This is the CFR. I don't know, Doc. I've got a good memory, and I can pull out of my mind news articles from 20-some years ago. I missed all these articles 12 years ago, or 10 years ago. I missed them. I do not recall seeing any news stories in 2012 about a post-Israel Middle East.
And it was also republished by Eurasia Review. Once again, America preparing for a post-Israel Middle East. And it asked that question, is that where we're headed here? And once again, as Rick said, who was talking about this? Who was even saying this? And yet we have in that window of time articles from Israel, Henry Kissinger speaking about this, about will Israel even exist in 10 years? So we have a few quotes here we want to go through and talk to you about. So this is from Eurasia Review, August 28th, 2012. So what is all the fuss about? It's a paper entitled Preparing for a Post-Israel Middle East, an 82-page analysis that concludes that the American national interest is fundamentally at odds with that of Zionist Israel. The authors concludes that Israel is currently the greatest threat to U.S. national interests because its nature and actions prevent normal U.S. relations with Arab and Muslim countries and, to a growing degree, the wider international community. So that's the first setup there. I had never heard anyone even discussing any of this, Rick.
No, not at all. And take a break here, Doc. I want to give an instruction to our guys in the control room. I forgot about this element from last week. Pull up the video of the Palestinian scholar who said on Palestinian TV that Israel was going to either disappear or move to Ukraine. I forget the exact words that he used, but I'll give you a few minutes there to find that video, and we'll go ahead and read the quotes in this Eurasia Review article from 2012.
So it goes on to say that this study was commissioned by the U.S. intelligence community comprising of 16 American intelligence agencies with an annual budget in excess of $70 billion. The IC, or intelligence community, includes the Departments of Navy, Army, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Defense Intelligence Agency, Departments of Energy, Homeland Security, State, Treasury, Drug Enforcement Agency, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and so many others. And so the National Security Agency, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Agency, and the Central Intelligence Agency all were partners in commissioning the study. So basically all the intelligence communities out there. So what was their conclusion? Well, Israel, given its current brutal occupation and belligerence, cannot be salvaged any more than apartheid South Africa could be when, as late as 1987, Israel was the only Western nation that upheld diplomatic ties with South Africa and was the last country to join the international boycott campaign before the regime collapsed. So the intelligence community was admitting that Israel was a brutal occupier, and that basically there was no hope for the future of Israel.
And that is apartheid.
Right. So Israel leadership, with increasing support of the 700,000 illegal settlers on the occupied West Bank, is increasingly out of touch with the political, military, and economic realities of the Middle East. The post-Labor government Likud coalition is deeply complicit with and influenced by the settlers' political and financial power and will increasingly face domestic civil strife, which the U.S. government should not associate itself with or become involved with. Now, we might want to wait there for just a moment and just kind of review that information. The intelligence community had basically concluded at this point that Israel's continued advancements into the West Bank by its settler communities was going to increasingly create future problems for Israel as it moved forward.
Just look at the news out of Zionist Israel for the past weekend, Doc.
Right.
I mean, they've had shootings. What they call terrorist attacks. The Palestinians are clashing with the Israeli occupiers in the West Bank. There's violence every day, and we're going into. I guess we're already into Ramadan, and I know King Abdullah has been communicating with Prime Minister Bennett in Israel.
Right.
He's very concerned about. There's going to be, possible eruption of violence in the West Bank and Gaza during Ramadan. So this is a way of life in the Zionist state. They are occupiers. The Palestinians have resisted. They're going to continue to resist. And to think, and what the intelligence community was saying in 2012 was, it's not going to change. It's not going to get better.
Right.
This Zionist state cannot last. It will eventually collapse because there's too much opposition to it. The fact that 16 intelligence agencies, the United States government, issued this report, it was never published to my knowledge. I don't know where this report has been for years. I've never seen it. But, obviously somebody knew about it because they wrote articles. Somebody leaked the report or something in 2012. But can you imagine that report coming out today?
It would just be shocking today because of the devotion that we have to Israel at this point. It just would just knock you over.
And nobody is allowed to criticize the state of Israel. Well, Rick, if you criticize the state, you're deplatformed.
Well, Rick, during that period of time from about 2010 through 2014, the Arab Spring was going on.
Yes.
That was during the Obama administration. Now, keep that in mind because the Obama administration was the one pushing the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. When we give you this next quote here, you're going to have a better understanding of why they were doing this, okay? So it goes on to say, the Arab Spring and Islamic awakening has to a major degree freed a large majority of the 1.2 billion Arab and Muslims to pursue what an overwhelming majority believe is the illegitimate, immoral, and unsustainable European occupation of Palestine of the indigenous population. And simultaneous with, but predating, rapidly expanding Arab and Muslim power in the region as evidenced by the Arab Spring, Islamic awakening and the ascendancy of Iran, and American power and influence recedes, the U.S. commitment to belligerent, oppressive Israel is becoming impossible to defend or execute consistent given paramount U.S. national interests, which include normalizing relations with the 57 Islamic countries. Gross Israeli interference in the internal affairs of the United States through spying and illegal U.S. arms transfers. This includes supporting more than 60 front organizations and approximately 7,500 U.S. officials who do Israel's bidding and seek to dominate and intimidate the media and agencies of the U.S. government, which should no longer be condoned. There's a lot in this quote.
This is a quote from a U.S. intelligence report. Doc, this sounds like true news.
Right.
Gross Israeli interference in the internal affairs of the United States through spying and illegal U.S. arms transfer. How about Jeffrey Epstein and a blackmail operation involving little girls? 60 front organizations inside the USA.
Right. Looking at the first part of this particular, outline, Rick, it does bring up the question, do they sacrifice diplomatic relations with 57 nations over the diplomatic relations with one nation.
Right.
And that's really at stake there. I'm not suggesting this. I'm just saying this out there. If there was no Israel, would we have a problem with Iran right now?
No.
We'd be doing business with Iran, wouldn't
That's right.
we? Because none of the Arab states aren't threatened by Iran. They're only threatened by Iran because Israel is there.
Yes.
Because if there's a conflict between Israel and Iran, the other Arab states will suffer for it.
That's right.
So, now I'm not suggesting anything there. I'm just saying that's the facts. And so, and to go on in that and say, basically that the United States government no longer has the financial resources or public support to continue funding Israel. The more than $3 trillion in direct and indirect aid from U.S. taxpayers to Israel since 1967, remember this is 2012, is not affordable and is increasingly being objected to by U.S. taxpayers who oppose continuing American military involvement in the Middle East. U.S. public opinion no longer supports funding and executing widely perceived illegal U.S. wars on Israel's behalf. The view is increasingly being shared by Europe, Asia, and the international public, and also by the next generation. The next generation of voters don't care about supporting Israel. So Israel's segregationist occupation infrastructure, evidenced by legalized discrimination and increasingly separate and unequal justice systems, must no longer be directly or indirectly funded by the U.S. taxpayers or ignored by the U.S. government. It goes on to say, Israel has failed as a claimed democratic state, and continued American financial and political cover will not change its continuing devolution as an international pariah state. Translated, it doesn't matter how much money or how much military aid we give to Israel, Israel is always going to be a pariah state to many in the UN.
So a reminder to our viewers, what we're reading are excerpts from a U.S. government intelligence community report in 2012. 16 U.S. intelligence agencies collaborated and produced this report. And these are the conclusions of this. This is shocking for me to find out that in 2012, the intelligence community of the United States of America issued a report to the President of the United States, who was Barack Obama at that time, saying the U.S. has got to get away from the state of Israel. We can't come out ahead. We're hurting ourselves by being aligned with the state of Israel. We got a couple more quotes,
right,
and then we're going to move on to the real stuff that we want you to see. But we're setting this up for you to see that there has been talk for a long time of ending the state of Israel in Palestine and moving it to Ukraine. I kid you not. You're going to be stunned when you see this. Here's another quote from that report.
So, increasingly rampant and violent racism exhibited among Jewish settlers in the West Bank is being condoned by the Israeli government to a degree that the Israel government has become its protector and partner. You cannot deny that. That's been the case. The expanding chasm among American Jews objecting to Zionism and Israeli practices, including the killing and brutalizing of Palestinians under Israeli occupation, are gross violations of American and international law and raise questions within the U.S. Jewish community regarding the American responsibility to protect innocent civilians under occupation. The international opposition to the increasingly apartheid regime can no longer be synchronized with American claimed humanitarian values or U.S. expectations in its bilateral relations with the 193-member United Nations. And the draft ends with language about the need to avoid entangling alliances that alienate much of the world and condemn American citizens to endure the consequences.
Okay, now we go to the next article from 2012. Haaretz, has our expiration date arrived?
So this article speculates here, puts out the idea that, are we going to see the end of Israel? Now remember, Henry Kissinger had said in 2012, just a month and a half earlier, prior to this, that in 10 years there will be no Israel. And then we have a major publication in Israel saying, has our expiration date finally arrived?
So we have now arrived at the date Henry Kissinger predicted would be the end of Israel. And what are we hearing? Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying Ukraine will become big Israel.
Right. So the gist of this article here in particular talks about the growing rift between secular Jews and religious Jews. Okay? And there's a quote in here, and it really stands out. And it says, the only question that remains, and this, remember, this is from 2012. The only question that remains is whether the people of Israel and their government are 70% religious Zionists or even only 60% religious Zionists. And when will we reach the critical mass of 90%? As soon as 2 years from now, or only in another 7? And so making the case here within this article that, you know, there's a lot of secular Jews that aren't necessarily as devoted to Israel as many religious Jews are, okay? And that at some point in the future, that's going to cause a conflict, that there might be a time in the future where Israel will no longer exist.
Or the secular Jews will separate from the religious Zionist Jews that are controlling the state of Israel.
Right.
So that brings us to today, and that's where we're headed. All right, so Doc, you found this next guy, and this is a new one to me. This man is a billionaire in Ukraine, the founder of Great Ukraine political party, kind of like the MAGA, Make Ukraine Great Again. His name is Igor Berkut.
Yes. And so this particular article from Mykolaiv asked the question, who is Berkut and who is his brother? Reflections on the New Jerusalem Project. Now, that's the one thing in particular that we want to focus on. Mr. Berkut has actually put out and is the executive director of the New Jerusalem Project, okay?
But his name is not Berkut.
Right.
He changed his name to Berkut.
Right. He was Igor Gecko at one time,
Yes.
and that kind of reminds me of that movie with Michael Douglas. He was Gordon Gecko. And so here we have another billionaire, but this billionaire has a very special project. His project is to establish the New Jerusalem in where else? Ukraine. And he's even gone so far as to actually start a settlement there. He says an epical event at the beginning of 2017, which the world media did not even mention in passing, was the landing of the first group of immigrants from Israel, headed by Igor Berkut in the port of Odessa. This group of 183 Jewish pioneers arrived in Ukraine from Haifa in order to lay the first stone in the foundation of heavenly Jerusalem on the fertile land of southern Ukraine. So on the first day of the coming year of the Red Rooster, that was 2017, the portal told the world. And so this is from a speech from Igor Berkut himself, the executive director of the project to create the main center of world Jewry in the territory of 5 southern Ukrainian regions. It became known that New Jerusalem by 2027. It will become a hotbed of prosperity for Jewish settlers built on the technologies of the 7th economic order. According to Igor Berkut, who is revered by many in Israel as Mashiach ben Yosef, the money and decisive breakthrough technologies for the heavenly Jerusalem will be given by the largest banking houses and global multinational corporations, most of which are owned by Jews.
People are calling him the Messiah?
Yes. So now this project, it's currently underway. You can look this guy up online. The Heavenly Jerusalem Project is a practical response, now listen to this, to the predictions of the well-informed political heavyweight Henry Kissinger and the late Palestinian prophet Sheikh Yassin that by 2022 to 2025, the residence of Jews in the current territory of Israel will become impossible due to the aggressiveness of the surrounding Muslim population, natural anomalies, and the future cataclysm battle of the end. All right, so there's a lot to absorb there so far, Rick. Now,
if this is accurate, beginning this year,
yes,
it's already started. We're going to see a a movement that will culminate in 2025 of the relocation of Jews from the state of Israel in Palestine to Ukraine.
Right.
And Israel will move. There will be a big Israel. Are we going to see a little Israel, a big Israel?
Or will Israel become the current, what they call the state of Israel? Notice it's not a nation of Israel, it's a state of Israel.
Because it was created by the United Nations.
Right, so it's a state of Israel. Maybe it becomes something else. Maybe it becomes a negotiated Holy Land for all three major faiths. And we'll touch on that here later in,
Doc,
in the program.
Is it feasible that the secular Jews are going to desert the state of Israel in Palestine and abandon it to the hardcore religious Zionist Jews?
Well,
and will the Zionist Jews be able to hold off an uprising by Palestinians? Will they be driven out, or will they recede to the pre-1967 borders of the state of Israel?
Well, and those are all great questions. I think the marketing ploy is going to be, you can have your old Jerusalem, we're going to New Jerusalem.
And what happens to Israel's nukes?
Well, and that's an even greater question there. So who
and how is Vladimir
that?
Putin going to feel about Israel moving its nukes to Ukraine?
Well, if you really dig down into some of the aspects of Berkut's philosophy, he's saying that there is a partnership actually going on behind the scenes with Russia to make this happen, with Russia and other and with leading Jews from around the world.
Could Vladimir Putin's personal rabbi, the man that we met in Davos,
He's Shabbat Lubavitch.
Yes.
So, and Shabbat Lubavitch is directly connected with this. And so, now, one more quote from that particular article. It says, an advanced group of Jewish settlers led by non-Jew Igor Berkut began preparing the infrastructure to receive the first 100,000 Israelis. Their arrival and resettlement in the territory of New Jerusalem and Odessa, and I'm going to butcher these names, is expected until mid-2018. In total, by the end of 2022, 6 million Jews from Israel and more than 12 million from Russia, the United States, and European Union are expected to arrive in the new homeland. So hold that up there for just a moment.
Well, how does this war help this to be materialized?
Well, Rick, the easiest way to build new things is to destroy everything that's already there.
And so is Russia...
And it moved all the Ukrainians, it moved 6 million Ukrainians out of Ukraine. Think about that. There are 6 million people that have left Ukraine in the past 2 months here. They have vacated Ukraine, 6 million, okay? Now, it is interesting that
And I brought this up last week, will Putin be required that Russia will have to pay war reparations in the billions, trillions of dollars to rebuild Ukraine?
Well, and now I'm beginning to think maybe that was all planned in the first place. Maybe the whole idea was not only to get Russia to destroy Ukraine, but also to pay for Ukraine. And
the way the Americans do it.
Yeah. So now we're going to show you the proposed map of the New Jerusalem. This is by, Igor Berkut's group. And you can go online, you can look up the name Igor Berkut. He has about 50 videos on YouTube right now that goes into details about all these things that are happening. So this is a map of what he calls Heavenly Jerusalem. So it's south and eastern Ukraine, particularly calling Kiev the New Jerusalem. And so, and naming different cities after, you got Solomon City, you got Moses City, you got Shofar City, you got the Khazar City up there in the upper right-hand corner of
do you recall, Doc, ancient Khazaria? Which part of present-day Ukraine did ancient Khazaria occupy?
Basically eastern Ukraine, all the way around the Black Sea to Georgia. And
so this would not...
It would include this.
This would include it.
Yep. So this would be included.
Also, I didn't bring the article, but I found another article. This guy, Berkut, said that Western Ukraine would be donated to Poland.
Now that's interesting. That might be a way to kind of settle, depending on how things, finally fall out with all of this, that in order to end the war, that they give, Western Ukraine to Poland to manage or whatever, and then Eastern Ukraine, it becomes this settled new homeland of some kind.
Where was Donbass in that?
I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
But we have a little bit more information on Igor Berkut here. This is his profile from the Russian version of Google, AllNet. Igor Berkut, in his youth, he was known as Igor Gecko, was born in '64. He is a Ukrainian political and public figure, best known for being the author of the idea and executive director of the Heavenly Jerusalem Project, the creation of a new Israel in part of Ukraine as part of the various regions there that we saw on the map.
This is not a coincidence that this guy is the leader of a major political party, Great Ukraine, in the country of Ukraine. He's a billionaire. And the fact that the current president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelenskyy, who is Jewish, is now referring to Ukraine as Big Israel. This is not a coincidence.
No.
And then you have Henry Kissinger's prediction 10 years ago, Israel would disappear, would be over by 2022. There's something to this. Now, Mr. Gecko changed his name to Mr. Berkut. So I looked up Berkut, and I found out that it's actually the name of a military police unit in Ukraine.
That's their actual symbol there.
The Berkut.
Right, that means golden eagles, basically. And this is an elite anti-riot police force in Ukraine. In fact, you might have even heard him mentioned on Fox News. They were featured the other day, and so
why would a billionaire change his name to? I mean, that would be like you changing your name to Raymond FBI.
Right.
I mean, why would he's calling himself? He named himself Golden Eagles, which everybody in Ukraine knows is an anti-riot special police force,
and has been for many, many years. So
and known for being, kneecap breakers.
Right. So we can speculate on why he did that, but he actually is sending a message. He's not a Jew himself.
Well, Mr. Zelenskyy said the new Big Israel would be a police state.
That's right. So managed by the Golden Eagles, I guess. And so there's a website on the Google Russian version of Google on AllNet that talks about the Heavenly Jerusalem Project. You can look up Heavenly Jerusalem and you'll find a lot of information on this. We'll skip, if you want to, Rick, let's skip 29, a lot of information that's repeated unless you feel like there's information there that you want, and get back to that quote on a TV interview that he did.
Yeah, okay.
So in 2017, Mr. Gecko, Mr. Berkut, did a TV interview, and this is what he had to say. Now remember, he's the executive director of this Heavenly Jerusalem Project. He says, I just got back from Israel, and it was my 6th visit. It turned out brilliant. I've lectured at several universities, in particular in Haifa, in Jerusalem. I was on television. Israel has many problems. One of the main ones is territory, of which 60%, it's a desert. Cities are overcrowded, very hot climate. There are also serious environmental problems. Israel's lagging behind in cleansing the country. The next problem is the state's environment. 8.5 million Jews live in Israel, this is 2017, and there are 100 million Arabs around Israel. Goes on to say, this situation could lead to aggression against Israel. Growing problems make us reflect on the future of this country. This mainly affects the young generation of Jews. They don't see a good perspective. Therefore, in order to develop normally, Israel must find another territory for itself for 200 or 300 years. It was one of the purposes of my visit to this country. This is where the concept of Heavenly Jerusalem or New Jerusalem comes in. According to my knowledge, this Heavenly Jerusalem is located in the south part of Ukraine in the districts that we talked about before. And so I think in those lands, a New Jerusalem will be established, which will allow the development of the entire nation of Israel. But it's not everything. Jews from all over the world, the largest banking houses and transnational corporations will collect their intellectual riches, technologies, and hand them over to New Jerusalem. And this New Jerusalem will begin to develop dynamically and so quickly that European countries will become an ordinary province for it. That the Europe will become a province to the New Jerusalem.
Satan has a counterfeit for everything that God has.
Yes.
He even has a New Jerusalem. I hadn't thought about it.
This idea of a New Jerusalem wasn't just dreamed up by this guy. Rick found some information today that this concept of parts of Ukraine as being New Jerusalem is actually a very old concept.
It is, and you can actually take courses at it at Notre Dame and other universities. Let's look at this next still.
So this is the Nanovic Institute, which is at the University of Notre Dame, okay? And look at the title of this course. You can take this course at Notre Dame. Moscow, the Third Rome. Kiev, the New Jerusalem. Religious History and Political Mythology in Contemporary Russia and Ukraine.
All right, now, Doc, I've known for years that many Russians consider Moscow the Third Rome.
And it was built on that premise. After Rome and Constantinople, Constantinople was the new Rome, and Moscow was established as the Third Rome.
And as we've pointed out many times, you can't understand modern-day Russia without understanding the spiritual, religious significance of Crimea, which has been part of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. That Crimea is from where Christianity arose and spread throughout Russia. So Vladimir Putin and many Russians have a very reverent viewpoint of Crimea because the Christian faith came from Crimea. So you have a deep-seated belief in Russia that Moscow is the Third Rome. But I've never known that there were people who believed that Kiev is the New Jerusalem. So you put these two together, what do we have?
And apparently it's been called that for nearly 1,000 years. I didn't realize that either. The idea being that the old Jerusalem had been destroyed. And the world recognized that. The world had accepted the fact that old Jerusalem had been plowed under and destroyed. Another city was sitting on the side of Jerusalem. And so you got about 800, 900 AD, you've got people that are establishing a new Jerusalem, a new place of religious authority. Another website, this is number 32 for Control, did an entire article on this idea.
And this is from the Religious Information Service of Ukraine.
And so Kiev, the New Jerusalem. And if you have seen pictures of Ukraine, you see these elaborate buildings and the awesome architecture, really all over parts of Ukraine. But the idea in this particular article from the RISU is that it has been in Ukraine's long memory of Kiev as being New Jerusalem. And we're just now catching on to this. Now, in the article, it says in July 2010, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church issued a statement calling Kiev the New Jerusalem because Ukraine's capital is a religious ideal that for centuries defined the spiritual, cultural, and political priorities of the people of Ukraine. Ukraine, the second largest and potentially one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, is re-examining its history and its place in the European family. Few in the West have noticed, and those that have don't fully understand Russia's anxiety about the reassessment of widely held and long accepted views of Russian-Ukrainian culture, history, and spirituality. And so one of the reasons why Russia is so interested in what's going on in Ukraine, really, Russia was birthed out of Ukraine. It came out of Ukraine, not the other way around.
All right, so Doc, you've got, you have Zionist Jews that want to declare Ukraine to be New Israel.
Right.
You've got a billionaire, a Ukrainian billionaire, political leader, who is leading the New Jerusalem movement.
Right.
And then you have the Russians and the Orthodox Church that for centuries have viewed Kyiv, Ukraine as New Jerusalem.
Right. So you've got a lot
And
of...
Moscow as the third Rome.
Yeah.
You've got... This idea is not just Jewish alone. It's not just Zionist alone.
No.
Okay, so is the Vatican in this?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because here in just a few days, they're trying to work out a meeting between Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. And so Israel and the Vatican are discussing the Pope's visit to Jerusalem for a meeting with Russian Patriarch. So they're going to go to the so-called current Jerusalem for a possible meeting. Now, what could this meeting entail?
I don't know. You know, when I saw it today, I mean, my first thought, Doc, this topic is what's under discussion. If I recall the article, the Pope, I think, is going to be visiting Lebanon in June.
Right.
And they're going to take him by helicopter to Jerusalem, and Patriarch Kirill is going to come in, and they're going to do a brief meeting in Jerusalem. The Pope of the Roman Catholic Church and the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, they have been split. The two churches have been split since, what, 1052?
Yes.
Something like that, the Great Schism.
And they've only met one time before, the two leaders of the two churches. Pope Francis and Kirill met in Cuba a couple years back.
Okay, now I'm going to take it way, way out there. And folks, I'm just, Doc and I are working this out on live video, okay? So I'm just sharing my thoughts as I go, because this is all new to me. Where is the Roman Catholic Church located?
Rome.
Rome. And where is the third Rome?
Moscow.
Okay. And the Pope is meeting with the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, whose headquarters is in Moscow, the third Rome.
Yes.
And they may be talking about a new Jerusalem in Kyiv, Ukraine. They may be. We don't know why they're meeting.
Well, we don't know why they're meeting, but you would assume that's to, talk about peace, about the war, right?
Yes.
Okay. We might have another angle on this, and this is coming out of the Catholic News Agency. Look at this article here. Ukrainian Catholic leader. Kiev is being transformed into the spiritual capital of the world. Now, kind of let that sink in for a moment. This is from the Catholic News Agency. They're not publishing anything out there that's not approved by the Vatican, okay? So,
all right, so Doc, for years, I've believed that the United Nations would eventually move to Jerusalem.
right.
I'm not so sure today about that. I'm starting to think the new United Nations, the replacement. What does Zelenskyy, what has he said? What has he said several times in recent weeks? A new, what was the phrase he used about a new organization?
Along the lines of, there need to be another organization that could actually stop war, basically.
Yes.
Because the current United Nations can't do it.
Yes, so Zelenskyy has proposed the ending of the United Nations and the creation of a new global organization that had the power to stop war in 24 hours.
Right.
Could that entity be headquartered in Kiev?
The New Jerusalem?
The New Jerusalem.
We were right on Jerusalem, we just didn't consider it might be somewhere else. So,
Did our guys in control, did you find the video of the Palestinian scholar? Do we have that to show? We showed it last week. If you have it ready, just let us know. If not, we'll just keep...
They do have it ready.
They do?
Right?
Okay. So we showed this to you last week. But with what we have given you today, pay close attention to what he said in this video and put all this together. Let's watch it.
توجهوا للشرق، الآن يريدوا روسيا وأمريكا تحت الصين، لأن أمريكا أصبحت الآن تخلت عنهم، لأن هذا المشروع قالت لهم باختصار مشروعكم فاشل وفي النهاية ستنتهوا، إن لم يكن العام سيكون العام الذي بعده، ونحن ندعم مشروع فاشل، فالآن هم يبحثوا عن بديل، والبديل هو قد تكون روسيا أو أمريكا، فلا يمكن أن يفسدوا علاقتهم مع روسيا وأمريكا مقابل حفنة من اليهود يذهبوا إلى الجحيم. أن الآن أصبحت قناعة حتى عند اليهود أنفسهم من بينهم ليبرمان ونتنياهو أن فلسطين لا تصلح أن تكون دولة لليهود. والآن أصبحوا يقولوا القدس المقدسة هي اللي في أوكرانيا وليست في فلسطين. والآن من المرشح لدولة اليهودية في المستقبل أوكرانيا. ممكن من أسباب الحرب اللي افتعلوها أن تصبح أوكرانيا فارغة. الغرب الآن يا أخي عنده قناعة هذه الدولة زائلة، هاي المشروع فاشل. إذن إيش الحل؟ الحل إذن بدل ما يكون الغرب يتبنى هذه الدولة وأمريكا تتبناه الصين مثلا وروسيا الآن، أو يكون هناك بديل. بل هناك دولة معروفة لدى العالم، دولة يهودية في شرق أوكرانيا، وكان أنا كنت أعرف الرقم 43، هم يقول 200,000 الآن، وعندها استقلال، وما كانوا يحبوا أن ينشروها حتى لا يقال لكم دولة اذهبوا إليها. لماذا تأخذوا فلسطين الآن؟ الآن هناك شعار يطرح أن الهيكل والقدس التوراتي وكذا هي في أوكرانيا وليست في فلسطين. وإن عجزوا أن ممكن يقول لك بكرة في هولندا.
One of the things he said in there, he said the reason they started this war was to empty out Ukraine.
And haven't they done that, Rick? They've 6 million people have left Ukraine since the 1st of March. That's a month and a half, less than a month and a half. They've moved out 6 million people. Now, once you move and have gone someplace else, it's unlikely you go back because you got new jobs, you've set up houses and everything. It's hard to move back. So you've emptied out a country, you bombed the daylights out of it, right? You've basically flattened it, you've destroyed infrastructure. Who wants to move back to that? If I'm in Poland and I've got running water and electricity and TV and a job, why would I go back to Ukraine and live in a bombed out apartment, maybe have electricity one day a week?
And Doc, to my knowledge, the war has not touched Western Ukraine.
Right.
So where are most of the Ukrainians living? Poland.
Yes.
So this idea that they're going to give Western Ukraine to Poland
isn't far-fetched at all.
So Poland gets rid of the Ukrainian refugees, puts them back into Western Ukraine, and Eastern Southern Ukraine becomes Israel.
But now, let's say you say to a bunch of citizens of the current state of Israel, instead of putting up settlements on the West Bank, they're not committed to Israel because of its religious significance or anything. They just want to they want to build a house. If they have to steal it from a Palestinian family, they'll do it, and they have been. But what if the proposal was made, listen, how would you like to have a lot of land? How would you like to participate in establishing a new Israel somewhere else?
Without any fighting.
Right.
The fighting's already been done. All you got to do now is go in and take it.
Right. How many of these Jewish companies, these Jewish billionaires and everything else would jump at the chance to establish that? More of a secular state, more of a European state than a religious state. We'll leave the religious Jews if they want to be near where the proposed side of the temple, they can stay. But the rest of us, the ones who want to do things and be
European?
Yes.
You mean like live like Europeans?
Right. They can live in a European country and call it New Israel and New Jerusalem.
And the Russian oligarchs who are hiding moved to New Israel.
Right.
And now they've got a new life and they're welcomed and they can rule this new country.
And what's interesting is a lot of these tech companies that are in Israel right now have for years outsourced a lot of their call centers and their technicians and everything to Ukraine. They've been there for a while.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And so there's so much related to this. We can go really
Doc,
deep with this.
Before we close, you have one more idea, and I don't know if you're prepared to talk about it. A minute or two here, but you were talking in my office today about an energy connection between the current Zionist Israel and Ukraine and involving the China Belt and Road.
Right. Well, it took me back when I thought about this when I was up in Missouri, that remember a couple years ago when they had this big energy deal. Israel had this big energy deal going on with Greece. This big, it's supposed to be Leviathan, remember? The big bubble of gas under the Mediterranean.
Right.
And so Greece and Israel have access to all this natural gas under the Mediterranean. But you've got to get it to market. You've got to get it to Europe. Europe is your market. That's where you want it to be. But for years, Israel has been developing pathways from Israel to Ukraine. Right now, the pipeline going through Ukraine is owned by the Russians. Mm-hmm. The Russians have that. And they're supplying the gas through Ukraine. Ukrainians are siphoning it off. But Israel, in order to get gas to Europe, either has to go over to Italy and up, or it goes up the Black Sea to Ukraine. Those are the two options there for it. And I got to thinking about that maybe, think about that Israel has sold the Haifa port to the Chinese. China wants access to Europe too. Rick, I think that Israel and China have already agreed on a handshake deal or a secret agreement or something like that, that they're going to develop that entire corridor from Israel all the way up through Greece and to Ukraine, uniting little Israel with big Israel with energy and new wealth for this new Israel in Ukraine. I don't think it's far-fetched at all. China wants to get to its products to Europe. And that may be, we were always confused. Why did Israel make a deal to sell the Haifa port to the Chinese? And of course, that perturbed America a whole bunch. Israel's got a long plan here, Rick.
Sure.
They've got a long plan here.
Where do you think Vladimir Putin is in this? Is he aware of it and participating with the plan, or is this totally opposite of what he's wanting to do?
Well,
I don't know.
I don't know either, but a lot of people involved in the New Jerusalem Project are of Russian descent.
Yes.
And, the Heavenly Jerusalem Project. And, in fact, Igor Berkut is Russian. He's not even Jewish.
Yes.
And
there are people suggesting that Berkut is a secret Russian agent.
There's some that have suggested that.
But what would be Putin's motivation in setting up big Israel in Ukraine?
Well, they would have the opportunity to rebuild. Instead of the Americans rebuilding a country, now Russia could rebuild a country. They would have that opportunity. They would have the contracts. They would have the opportunity. After all, we're sorry we blew it up. We'll rebuild it. And so that might be one take on it.
Hey,
so
if you have any ideas, write to us. You can email us at info@truenews.com, info@truenews.com, and your comments will get over to me, and I'll read them with interest.